Now we're going to go ahead and get started making our pureed butternut squash soup. And the reason that we are doing this recipe for this lab is because the first step in preparation for the squash is to actually steam it. So we are going to go ahead and get started with that. Now the recipe calls for 1 large shallot. When I went to the grocery store, they didn't have any large ones, so I have 2 tiny little ones. That's what I'm going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and mince this. So we can do a couple of steps of preparation here at the counter, and then we'll take it over to the stovetop for the rest of the prep time. And really what we're going to do here is mince the shallot, cut the butternut squash into pieces, and scrape the seeds and stringy fibers out of the inside. But we are not going to toss those away. They are important in this recipe, and so we want to hang on to them. I'm going to be putting them in this little bowl, and we will use them in one of the following steps. All right, so I have my shallot ready to mince. I'm going to cut the little ends off here. And really, from this standpoint, I'm just going to do small slices. You can see how I'm leaving the tip of my knife down as I go through this. And I don't want that piece or that piece. Cut my little root ends off here. You can even try, if you get it lined up right, do both halves at the same time. Keeping your fingers out of the way, of course. And similar to the way we mince garlic, once you have it thinly sliced, just run over it a few times with your knife. Here we're looking for small, uniform pieces. There isn't the same requirement for uniformity as when we dice something. We're going to get this really small into a mince, and then we'll set it to the side. All right, now the next thing we're going to do is deal with our butternut squash. We're going to cut it in half. And the skin of a butternut squash can be pretty tough, so this one might require a little bit of finesse. Be careful with this. You'll see where the seeds are down in the bottom. Now carefully, safety first. All right, and I have a spoon. I'm just going to scoop the seeds and fibers out. And remember, we're keeping those. So the first thing we're going to do in order to cook this butternut squash is put it in the steamer. And what we'll be using in lab is one of these collapsible steamers that goes inside our Dutch oven or pot. And so the way that we're going to steam this is by taking the butternut squash and we're going to cut it into relatively uniform sizes. Remember, we want our squash, the reason we cut it in half is we want it to be at the same thickness. It'll cook better that way. So remember, when steaming, as with other forms of cooking, you want your pieces to be about the same size so that they'll be done at about the same time. What I'm going to do here is just start by cutting these pieces in half. I'm leaving the peel on the squash, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and start laying them in the steamer to see how they fit. And it's possible that I might need to cut down the size a little bit. It's kind of like a puzzle. Make sure everything fits in there the way it needs to fit. This squash, the second squash, is a little bit bigger, and so cutting it into 3 pieces I think will be just fine. It'll help us to fit everything into the steamer all at once. Okay, now we're ready to go ahead and get started cooking our butternut squash soup. The first step is to take 2 tablespoons of our butter and get it melted in the Dutch oven. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And I cut my butter into 4 equal tablespoons just to make this process easier. So I'm going to go ahead and melt that 2 tablespoons, and then I'm going to get the shallots going inside. It's going to be about 2 to 3 minutes to get those done. I'm going to let my butter melt first. Okay, my butter has melted over medium-low heat, and now I'm going to go ahead and add the shallots. I'm going to cook these until softened. It's going to take about 2 to 3 minutes. All right, these shallots are looking good. So the next thing I'm going to add are the butternut squash seeds and scrapings. And these are going to take about 4 minutes to cook. Just working those in. Till it starts to get fragrant. All right, it's been about 4 minutes and the squash and seeds are smelling very fragrant. It's looking good. So the next thing we're going to do is add 6 cups of water and a teaspoon of salt, and then we're going to bring that to boil over high heat. All right, so my liquid has now come to a boil, and what I'm going to do is decrease my heat to medium-low. I'm going to take my steamer basket with the butternut squash and drop it down inside. All right, and then what I'm going to do is cover it, and it's going to steam in here for about 30 minutes or so, and we'll come back and check it and make sure it's done. It's been a little over 30 minutes, and checking our squash now. Remember, when you open the lid, always open it away from you so the steam doesn't rise up directly into your face. And we're going to test the doneness by taking a small paring knife and just putting it through the skin side of the squash and see how easily that's just going right in. Very little resistance at all. This is done. And so what we're going to do is, using some tongs, we are going to pull the squash out and just put it on this rimmed baking sheet to cool down. Set that aside. And now we're going to remove our steamer from the pot. And we're going to ladle out the liquid into this measuring cup. We want to reserve 3 cups of the cooking liquid, but we don't want the solid. So I'm using my fine mesh strainer. That's 3 cups of liquid. Just going to set that aside and then discard the solids. Now that we've done that, we can get rid of the rest of this liquid, and we'll come back. I'm going to rinse out the Dutch oven, I'm going to dry it out, and then we're going to come right back to the same pot to finish our recipe. Now that our squash has been cooling here for a few minutes and we've pulled away our reserved soup liquid, or the kind of the broth that formed from the steaming process, what we're going to do is take a spoon and scoop out the inside of the squash. We don't need the skins. And basically what we're going to do is just scoop the flesh out of the squash, and in batches we will puree the squash and the broth until it's nice and smooth. So you want to get as much of the flesh out as you can. See how easily that scoops out. It's an indication that it's cooked all the way through. If you are having a hard time scooping it out, it would let you know that it should have cooked just a little bit longer. We'll start with that. I'll probably add one more scoop of squash here. That'll probably be about half of the squash. And I'm just going to do it in 2 batches. So I'll do about half the squash and half the liquid. Puree it till it's nice and smooth, and then do the rest. Now, anytime you're working with a blender and hot liquids, you always want to make sure you have a towel over the top, just in case any of that comes out. All right, we've reached the final stages of making the soup. I've just pureed the last batch of broth and squash together in the blender. I'm about to pour that in. See how nice and smooth it is. Now what I'm going to do is return my heat back up to a simmer. I want to get every last bit out. And into this is going to go the final 2 tablespoons of butter, the brown sugar and pinch of nutmeg, and my half a cup of heavy cream. I'm going to stir that up. Let it return to a simmer. And it's going to be ready to eat. I'm going to serve this with some homemade croutons that I've tossed in olive oil and a little salt and pepper. I'm going to sprinkle those on top, and it's what my family's eating for supper tonight. Smooth and velvety, really delicious. Great exercise for learning how to steam. Hope you enjoy.